So today we will discuss intertemporal decision making, which are decisions that decide how to allocate resources across different times. So here is the outline for today. We will introduce what intertemporal decision making is and one rational model to study intertemporal decision making. That is discounted utility model. Okay, so if people make decisions according to discounted utility model, then we will observe time consistency. Right? So we will define what time consistency is. And then we'll talk about the actual temporal discounting we observe from human behavior and how it contradicts with discounted utility model. It means that people do not make decisions in a so-called rational way or consistent way. Instead, they present the so-called present bias. And then we talk about a phenomena that is related to intertemporal decision making, which is self-control problem, and also how to solve self-control problem using pre-commitment. Right? So here is an example, some tasks that you finish in our experiment also during class. Right? So do you prefer 1,000 kroner today or 1,100 kroner 3 months later? Right? So that is the so-called preferences about allocations over time. And it turns out that people prefer certain consumptions today to uncertain consumptions in the future. Right? So this is a phenomena that we know very well. Here we have a story about the grasshopper and the ants. Right? So grasshopper, he just enjoy the time to try to live at the present and do not worry about the future. But when the winter comes, it's a problem, right? So you probably already heard these tales about the grasshopper and the ant. The ant, always plan for the future, even though it seems that they are stupid because they spend all the time working without enjoying life. But when the hardship comes during the winter time, they can survive. So that's one example of how you make decisions to allocate resources across time, right? And then here is a video clip you can watch on your own. It's just the trade-off between now versus the future in a night tale, right? So a team of the main character in this movie, they just won some award, and some of the teammates want to use the money to buy some food, buy some drinks, alcohol, so that they can enjoy life. But the main character says that if we invest this money today so that we can purchase better gear, so we will win a lot more awards in the future. So that is again the trade-off between a smaller consumption today versus big consumption tomorrow. So whether you're patient enough to wait for a bigger award. So now you probably have sensed that intertemporal decision making is closely related to people's level of patience. Right? So in order to understand how people make decisions in intertemporal decision making, it's probably best for us to understand their preferences about time, right? That is measured by patience, right? So here is a task that most of you have completed in our experiment, in class experiment. Basically, the task asks you to make the trade-offs between some money you receive today or another slightly bigger amount of money you receive in the future. And so in this specific task, you are asked to choose between receiving $100 today or some larger amount of money in 2 weeks' time, right? And you see that the left choice is always the same across all the decisions, but the amount of money that you can receive in the future change in size. So for most people, for the first decisions, they will probably choose $100 today compared to $100 in 2 weeks, right? So just for the reason that you can enjoy using the $100. Also, if you put this money in the bank, you will earn some interest, and also 2 weeks time, there's a lot of uncertainty. So $100 today it's definitely better than $100 in 2 weeks' time, right? And then you will see that as we move down the roads, the size of the money that you can receive in the future would increase. So that means for most people, at a certain point of time, they will probably switch from left decision, $100 today, to some amount of money in 2 weeks' time. If the amount of money paid in 2 weeks is large enough, then it would induce people to wait to receive this larger amount of money in the future, right? So the later that people are willing to switch, that means the less patient people are, right? The earlier people would like to switch to the right, meaning they are more patient, right? So that means if you switch in the second row, meaning that you are willing to wait, to get one additional dollar for 2 weeks, right? Compared to $100, right? So by investigating the point people switching from left to right, we can have a measure and understanding of their level of patience. So here is the distribution of the switching point from an experiment. So this experiment was conducted at Northwestern University, and more than 500 MBA students completed the task. As you can see here, if you switch in very early, then the discounting rate is at 0%. If you do not switch at all, it means that 12% of additional payment would not induce you to wait. Right? So it means that your discounting rate is actually greater than 12%. Right? So if this discounting rate is smaller, that means you are more patient. If it's larger, that means you are more impatient. So we study patience, but why is it important for us economists to study patience? Is patient important, right? It has been demonstrated that patience level is related to a lot of economic performance on the aggregate level, right? So here is an interesting survey study that have a large amount of survey and responders across the globe that tell us the level of patients, right? So the tasks are similar to the task that you see in the previous slide, right? So that can help us to understand the corresponding discounting rate. So the color that is more red, that means people are less patient. More blue, that means people are more patient. We observe a lot of observations, right, across different countries. Now here, this slide demonstrates the correlation between the level of patience and some of the economic performance, right? So on the X level, it represents the level of patience, right, measured by the task that we've seen before. On the Y-axis, on the left panel, it represents GDP per capita. So we see there's a positive correlation. And if you look at, instead of the wealth level, the GDP per year, but we look at the GDP growth, we also observe this positive correlation. And here are some additional measures. Patience is also correlated with average years of schooling and also net adjusted savings. It also correlated with the innovation index and the R&D expenditure, how much you want to invest in R&D so that you have better technology, even though the money you invested is something that you cannot consume today. But in the future, you would hope that this investment would bring you a larger return, right? So we see this correlation. Of course, as economists, you should be aware that correlation does not mean causation. And so it doesn't mean patience causing all those different performance measures. There might be some other factors that are explaining both factors, but I just want to show you that is correlated with a lot of economic performance indicators, right? So that is actually an important indicator, important variable, important concept, important preferences for us to understand. Now, talking about patience, we have to introduce a very important concept called interest. Right? Again, if we go back to the question we asked before, which do you prefer, whether 1,000 kroner today or 1,000 kroner next year? Well, most people would prefer 1,000 kroner today, right? So because people are impatient, right? So impatience is describing the fact that we prefer certain consumptions today to uncertain consumptions tomorrow. And the interest rate that you pay people in order to induce them to wait so that to save the money and for a bigger amount of money later, that is a measure of people's impatience level, right? So the idea of interest was famously introduced and discussed by Irving Fisher, right, in this book, The Theory of Interest, right? So it's interesting to observe that the concepts of interest are not well received in all cultures, right? So even though we probably understand that being impatient is human nature, so that in order to induce people to save money, you have to give them something back, right? As which would be the interest you pay them. But in a lot of cultures, in many religions, charging interest is immoral, right? So here is an interesting story you probably have heard. It's written by Shakespeare, the Merchant of Venice, right? So we know that interests are necessary to induce people to give up current consumption. They can be considered as the price of borrowing from the future. Without interest, people needing money today cannot get it because we know everyone is impatient. If you don't pay interest, you cannot induce them to lend you money, right? But it could be make you better off to get that money, even though you have to pay some interest. Right? It is not that people are greedy, so they charge interest. It's just because being patient is human nature. And in order to be able to borrow money from other people, you have to pay something back. Interest rate depends on future uncertainty. Consider the following situation. Suppose there is an imminent disaster, right? How would that influence interest rate? It probably would make people more impatient, right? So if there's an imminent disaster, meaning that there's a lot of uncertainty and the future might not exist, right? So in 2 weeks of time, maybe a lot of people are not there anymore. So that means there's a lot of uncertainty and people would try to, make the consumptions today. So that in that case, the interest rate would be much higher because now you have to pay a lot more, right, in order for people to be willing to lend you money. That also explains why microfinance have really high interest rate. Right? Sometimes it's more than 30% or up to 70%, because microfinance, the ability of repayment of the borrower is low. There's a lot of uncertainty involved. So in order for people to be willing to lend the money to those people, the interest rates have to be high. The payback rate, it has to be higher, right? So talking about interest rate, we can think about the phenomena called compounding or compound interest rate, right? With principal P and interest rate R, the amount of money after N periods is P multiplied by 1 plus R to the N. Right? So you see, we have this exponential growth rate. So that's the idea of compound interest rate. So there's a saying that compound interest is one of the most powerful forces in the universe. So this quote has been claimed to be said by Albert Einstein, right? But if you check, Albert Einstein never said these things, but it does contain some wisdom in it, right? So it's a powerful force. So the following figure demonstrates the power of compound interest. Right? So the power of compound interest becomes more salient as time passes by. Right? So here, let's assume we have the principal $1,000, and we have interest that are not compounding. Right? So there is a certain interest that you pay, but you're not compounding, meaning that you withdraw the interest. You will see that will have a linear growth. But if we reinvest the interest you earn, then we would be able to observe the exponential growth. And also the benefits are most obvious as time goes by, right? So in later time, we'll be able to see a much bigger benefit. So that's the power of compound interest, right? So this idea of compound interest can explain a lot of phenomena. So that the major phenomena we could explain is the power of time. So for example, you have 1,000 Danish kroner in a savings account with an annual interest rate of 5%. How much do you have after 1 year? This is easy to calculate, right? So that is 1,000 plus 1,000 times 5%. How about 5 years? And then 10 years. How about 50 years? All right. So if you have clearly understood the corresponding power of time or the power of compound interest, you will be able to predict that after 50 years, the corresponding amount of money you have will be significantly bigger compared to 1 year or 5 year. So here is, again, a quite interesting example to calculate some of to understand some of the economic phenomena in history, right? So it has been said that a Native American sold Manhattan Island to the colonist in 1626 for only $24. Is it a good deal? People would have been criticizing the Native American lacks of the corresponding wisdom, so they do not know how to charge the amount of money, right? But if you consider the power of time, right? So with just assume there's a 6% rate of return, this $24 would become 212 billion US dollars. And even though we have a really high inflation, and with the inflation rate of 3,000%, this is still equivalent to 6.3 trillion in 2018 dollars, right? So now think that in 2024, the US GDP is 29.18 trillion, and New York City's GDP is $1.8 trillion. So that means if this Native American will be able to invest those $24, maybe not just a good investment, just with a reasonable investment, just 6% return rate, then his descendant could buy back much of the now impoverished, much improved land, right? So back then it was just an island with nothing, but now you know that Manhattan is the most dynamic and a rich area in New York City. Now, this power of time can also be reflected by the net worth of Warren Buffett, right? So if you look at his wealth, most of his money or the returns he received are during his later years, right? So that's why the famous economist Paul Samuelson has mentioned that investing should be more like watching paint dry or watching grass grow. If you want excitement, take $800 and go to Las Vegas, right? So in order to be able to see your corresponding worth of investment, you have to be patient, to wait for the power of time to exert its influence. Okay. So that is the idea of interest and compound interest and the power of time. Now, a related concept would be present value. Once we know the idea of interest, then we can define present value, right? Present value is value determined at the date of valuation. Because of interest that you can receive when you put this money, cash in the bank, then the future 100 Danish kroner will be less than 100 Danish kroner today, right? And the present value will be just converting future cash, future money to the current money. That is the basic idea of present value. Present value is less than future value because money would earn interest. So here is the idea. The present value is PV and the future value is FV. And suppose the future is n periods later, right? So that means the future value to be converted to the present value has to be divided by the 1 plus interest rate to the nth power. Right? So that's the idea of the formula, how to calculate the present value. Future value needs to be discounted to get the present value. Just back to the idea of interest rate. So here we can write this 1 over 1 plus r as delta. Right? So delta here is the inverse of 1 plus r. Is often referred to as the discount factor, meaning how the future value will be discounted to get the present value. Right? So r is the interest rate. So sometimes when we try to get the present value, we don't use the interest rate as the discount rate. Right? So there may be some people's different level of impatience level. Right? So R can be considered as the corresponding discount rate, while delta is considered or is referred to as the discount factor. Right? So discount rate and discount factor, they are related, but you see here they are different things, and their relationship is defined by this following expression. Okay, so that is the important concepts related to intertemporal decision making. Right, so basically, the interest rate, which measure people's general impatience level in the economy, and then present value. Right, so in order to calculate the future values to the present value, the future value has to be discounted. Now we are ready to introduce a model for us to understand intertemporal decision making, which is discounted utility model. So discounted utility model is a model for intertemporal decision making in neoclassical economics, meaning that it has the assumption that people make a rational choice. Discounted utility model prescribes the rational decision maker have exponential discounting. So that means from the point of view at time 0, the utility of receiving ut at time t is described in the following expression. Right? So the utility of receiving ut at time 0 is the future utility multiplied by the discount factor to the tth power, meaning that the future utility is discounted to get the current utility. That's why it's called discounted utility model. Right? So you see here, this discounting is very similar to this discounting of future value to the present value, right? So we discount future value, we get the present value. We discount future utility, we get the present utility. Right? So that's why it's called discounted utility model. And here, delta is called a discount factor, right? So this discount factor is different from the discount factor in the PV value, in the present value formula. We just use the same notation because we use discounting for both present value and the discounted utility model. Right? Here, different individuals would have different discount factor. Right? So when people have high discount factor, meaning they are more patient. So if we assume people have exponential discounting according to the discounted utility model, then they will make time-consistent decisions because they have time-consistent preferences. Right? So what do we mean by time-consistent preferences? It just basically saying that if you prefer A to B at time point A or at time point 1, you will also prefer A to B at time point 2. Right? So this seems to be reasonable, right? So that's why it is assumed by the discounted utility model, right? So it prescribed time consistency, right? If you prefer A to B at today, you should also prefer A to B tomorrow. So let's see why time consistency is implied by discounted utility model. So let's first calculate utility at time 1, T1. Right? So for choosing the outcome A, the corresponding discounted utility at T1 is expressed here, right? So we need to discount the future utility experienced at T1. We need to discount the future utility experienced at T by the discount factor to the difference of the two time point. Right? So this is the discounted utility of A at time point T1. And similarly, this is the discounted utility you experience at time T1. And similarly, this is the discounted utility for B experienced at time T1. And then let's look at another time point T2. So the option A, the future utility UTA experienced at time T2 is expressed here, and similarly for option B, UTB, the corresponding utility experienced at time point 2 is expressed here. And so it should be discounted, always discounted by the discount factor, the time difference. Yeah. Now, let's assume that at time point T1, you prefer A to B. Then we know the utility you experience for A, option A is greater than the utility you experience at time T1 for option B. Right? Plug in the corresponding expressions, we will have this. So basically, there's nothing but plug in the corresponding expression. Right? Now, what you can do is to minus T2 and plus T2 is still exactly the same as the previous expression. So that's why this inequality still hold. Right? And now you see here, we can separate the discount factors into two. Right? So here we have discount factor to the power T2 minus T1, and then here we have the discount factor to the power T minus T2. Right? And we also know that here we have the common factor, meaning because they are positive, we can eliminate them. We still have this inequality, right? So because this hold by derivation, we can work out that this also hold. But now look at the corresponding measure of utility of two options experienced at T2, right? So this is exactly the same as the utility of A experienced at T2, and this is exactly the same as the utility of B experienced at T2. So that means we derive the following inequality. The utility experienced from getting A at point T2 is greater than the utility you experience for option B experienced at time T2, right? So this implies that because your utility is higher, you prefer A to B, right? So this is derived from this inequality. What that means, whenever at any point T1 you prefer A to B, then at any other point T2 you also prefer A to B. So that is the idea of time consistency. Now, let's just try to consider whether this discounted utility model is a good description of people's behavior. In other words, whether it is a good descriptive model. In other words, do we observe time consistency? Do we observe every time consistent decision making? Well, if you think and pay close attention, it's not difficult for you to observe a lot of time inconsistencies. Right? So here is one example: $100 received 1 year later, 365 days later, versus $110 received 366 days later, right? So $100 received 1 year later, $110 received 1 year plus 1 day later. In this decision, a lot of people and most people would want to wait this one extra day, right, to receive this additional $10. But if you ask a quite similar question, do you want to receive $100 today versus $110 tomorrow? Most people would actually choose $100 today, something for certain, to eliminate the uncertainty. So that's one example of time inconsistency. And also, commitment is a big issue. Self-control is a big issue. That also demonstrates some time inconsistency, right? So New York's resolution is a great example. You want to access more to eat healthier diet, but after a month, you probably already forget, or it's very difficult for you to carry on. Right? So at the start of New Year, you make the plan that in the future you always want to exercise more. You would always prefer some healthy diet, but when the time comes, when the temptations are there, it's always tempting, to lay on the couch to watch another episode from Netflix or have another snacks, some chips to enjoy the time there. Right? So that's time inconsistency. And also addictions to tobacco, alcohol, drugs. A lot of people who got addicted, who are smokers, for example, they said that they would rather not to smoke, right? And that means if they are able to make the decision all over again, they will not decide to get to become a smoker because they know the adverse effect to their health. But it's very difficult for them to get rid of this bad habit. That's again time inconsistency, right? And procrastination. Almost everyone have at one point at least experienced this procrastination problem, right? So you would prefer to finish certain tasks sooner rather than later, but when the time comes, you think, oh, I could, enjoy this 1 hour of TV, then I will be more focused to do this task. Time inconsistency. Right? So here is a very interesting quote from Oscar Wilde. Good resolutions are useless attempts to interfere with scientific laws. Their origin is pure vanity. Their result is absolutely new. Right? So this is a code describing this time inconsistency. Right? So once understood that time inconsistency is prevalent, that is probably saying this discounted utility model is not a good descriptive model. I mean, it's maybe good prescribing what you are supposed to do, but it's not a good model to describe human behavior, to help us understand human behavior. So that's why we need to introduce some behavior insight into the model so that we can better understand human behavior and to better predicting what they are likely to do. So that's our next topic, tempo discounting. What is the actual tempo discounting we observe from people? It's far from exponential discounting. So one important phenomena related to tempo discounting is present bias, meaning stronger weight is placed on present and immediate reward. Present bias have two related aspect. One is called sign effect. Losses discounted less than gains, right? So this may be related to the idea of loss aversion, right? So losses loom larger than gains. And because it looms larger, that means they discounted when you make decisions across time. Another aspect of present bias is magnitude effect, meaning large outcomes discounted less than small ones. Large outcomes, because they are large in size, it's easier to notice them, so they are discounted less. Small one, when you discount it, they are almost gone. So these two are actually related. Right? So something obvious will be discounted more. Something salient will be discounted more. Right? So larger outcome are easier for you to identify, so they are discounted more. Losses are easier for you to identify by your mind because of loss aversion. You pay a lot of attention to losses, then you also discount them less when you make intertemporal decision making. And because of present bias, we would observe time inconsistency. Plans made early are not carried out when times comes. And present bias and time inconsistency also exist not only in human beings, but also in animals. And people are willing to pay to tie their own hands with commitment products, right? So these are all examples of present bias and time inconsistency. People, to some extent, know they are present biases, right? So they can predict that in the future, they will be tempted by something, and um, so that they are not able to control themselves to carry out the corresponding plan. And that's actually one reason this commitment products can work. Right? So that's something that we will discuss more about this self-control. So here is a quite interesting illustration. So that's a very nice illustration of present bias. So this is depicting the view of the world from the Ninth Avenue. So it was first appeared in the cover of the New Yorker. So as a New Yorker, when you look at other places, something near you seems very obvious. But when you go further, like Hudson River is still near Manhattan in the New York City, but it seems quite smaller. But when you consider Chicago, Kansas City, and Las Vegas, California, they are farther away. But you see the distance between the 9th and 10th Avenue seems to be larger in your mind when you view this from this picture than the distance between Los Angeles than Utah or than Las Vegas. Right? And then we see there are China, Japan, and Russia. I mean, they are grouped together. So that's a nice illustration, right? So something distant from you. I mean, they seem indistinguishable. Right? Something near you, then you are easy to identify the corresponding difference. Right? Future is viewed through a faulty telescope. So that's a good way to understand, an intuitive way to understand present bias. Year 1 and year 2 may look just 3 months apart, and any days after year 2 look closer to each other. So that's an intuitive way to understand present bias, a good illustration. That's why I think it's nice for me to show you this illustration. So mathematically, we can model the present bias using hyperbolic discounting. Present bias can be measured by an additional parameter beta. So you see here the hyperbolic discounting model differ from the exponential or discounted utility model simply by adding a parameter that measures present bias. So beta, which is less than or equal to 1 and greater than 0, measures present bias. Right? So if you take off beta, it's exactly the same as discounted utility model. Right? So if beta equals 1, that means you are rational in the sense that you're time consistent. You have exponential discounting. But whenever you have beta less than 1, that means you are present biased. So in this hyperbolical discounting model, impatience is measured both by beta and delta. Right? So that's why it's also called the beta delta model of time preferences. And the discounted utility model is called delta model of time preferences. So if we look at how our brain works when we make intertemporal discounting, intertemporal decision makings, time discounting is associated with a certain neural network. So there are two neural networks that are activated, that are engaged when we make decisions across time. So the first regions called frontal regions, they are activated for all intertemporal decision making, intertemporal choices. So these are area with higher cognitive function, right? More towards system two thinking. And limbic and paralimbic cortical structures, they are activated for choices involving immediate rewards, right? So in this region, they are rich in a dopaminergic intervention, right? So dopamine would actually be released, and it actually motivate you to choose the immediate reward, right? So this is a good reflection of emotional influence. Greater activity in the frontal parietal regions than in limbic regions were associated with choosing larger delayed rewards, meaning that you become more patient when you are able to activate more the cognitive functions, the system two thinking. The study also concluded that it's mainly the experience of immediate emotion rather than your devaluation of your future expected emotion drives impulsivity, right? So it is just because that you experience this strong emotion towards the immediate reward, you are motivated and tempted to take the immediate action, right? So it's not the devaluation. You think the future reward is not worthy, right? It's mainly that you are driven by the immediate emotion. Neuroscience has also demonstrated that geographical, temporal, of psychological distance have similar effect on self-relevant system. Psychological distance shift activity dorsally in this medial prefrontal cortex. If you recall, the self-relevant system and the value system mainly exist in medial prefrontal cortex. And it has been observed that these ventral medial prefrontal cortex are more activated, are more active when you are thinking about yourself or some people who are close to you psychologically. Medial prefrontal cortex, they are more active when you are thinking about someone else or someone who feels distant from you, far away from you psychologically. And the study on intertemporal decision making also demonstrated that when you try to think about your future self, it's similar in the brain mechanism to you are thinking about someone else. It's interesting to observe that the future self is treated more like another person, right? Because when the future self is another person, it reduces self-related medial prefrontal cortex response. So tempo discounting is not just about delayed reward, it's about how close the future self feels. That gives us an important implication. Increase this future self-connectiveness can reduce discounting so that you may become more patient, right? For example, episodic future thinking, future self imagery, and age-progressed avatars are all demonstrated to be effective in reduce discounting, to increase savings, to make people more patient. One interesting piece of evidence supporting this idea is from studying people's languages they speak. Right? If you look at the languages people speak across different cultures, different countries, they differ dramatically. But one interesting way that they differ is closely related to intertemporal decision making and the discounting of the future. So here are three examples of the language people speak. So we have English, we have Danish, and we have Chinese. Happen to be the three languages that I know something of, right? So you see here, in different languages, they encode time differently. In English, you distinguish the past and the future by changing the form of verbs you use, right? So you see here, it rained yesterday, it is raining now, it will rain tomorrow. So we have different forms to represent different time point, whether it's in the future, whether it's in the past, or whether it's happening now. Danish is distinguished a little bit, but not that clearly. So the way you describe the present and the future are quite similar. So here you see the eine nu or the eine imorgen. So you have the same form for the verb, right? So for the past, it's different. It's differed slightly. You have the eine. In Chinese, it does not distinguish different time tenses at all. So use describing the same thing. Literal translation would say that it rained yesterday, it rained now, it rained tomorrow. There's no change in the verbal form at all. So you see that across these three languages as examples, languages, they associate the future and the present differently, right? So the question we may want to ask is, can languages that grammatically associate the future and the present foster future-oriented behavior? Why we want to investigate this question? Well, it's because the previous slides has demonstrated that the distance you feel between your current self and your future self is related to your level of patience, your level of discounting, and maybe also have some implications for your behavior, right? So if in the language that the future self and the present self are not clearly distinguished, maybe people would care more about the future self because the psychological distance between the current self and the future self is not that high. And then the behavior economist Keith Chen investigated this question. And here is a demonstration of the future tense used across different, a wide range of languages, right? So if you have a lot of future tense used, meaning that you try to distinguish the future self to your present self. If there's 0% of future tense use, that means you probably feel your future self to be closer to your present self, right? So examples here include Chinese and Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, even though they have some distinction, but the distinction is quite low. They only use around 10%, like in Danish, only 10% of the future tense are used in weather forecast. And in Japanese and in Chinese, it's 0%, right? So keeping this in mind, if the corresponding hypothesis is true, then we might expecting people's behavior would related to intertemporal decision making would differ depending on what type of language they speak. And here, indeed, we find some evidence about the language you use and the savings rate the whole country would observe. So in this graph, on the x-axis, it represents the share of households speaking a strong future tense language, right? On the y-axis, it represents the percentage of household savings. As we can see here, if you have a high share of future tense use, meaning that you try to distance your future self, your savings rate will be lower because you care not a lot about your future self. And here is an additional table confirming this. In some countries, different household may speak different type of language with different future tense usage percentage. Right? And by investigating those household within the country, I mean, you can say that they have more homogeneous economic status. Right? And it's still demonstrating that household with language usage that have a high future tense usage are saving less compared to the other families with less future tense usage. So another interesting application of this distance between future self and present self is we can use the imagination, the picturing of your future self to change people's behavior. And this following study, quite an interesting study, has demonstrated that you can successfully motivate people to save more. So in this experiment, participants come to the lab. Some participants, they are able to interact with their future self using virtual reality. And so here is an example, right? So here is the actual table, and then based on the table, the virtual reality make an avatar, which represent the present self, and also an aged avatar, which represent the future self. And this has been demonstrated that interacting with an aged avatar oneself through virtual reality leads participants to allocate twice as much money to retirement fund. Based on and motivated by this research, this so-called phase retirement program is created and used by Bank of America and Merrill Lynch to motivate people to save more. One last phenomena I want to discuss related to temporal discounting is how anticipation could influence immediate well-being. Contrary to the discounted utility model, people often delay pleasurable event and speed up dreadful event. For example, people would like to have pleasurable deferral of a vacation. They would try to speed up of a dental appointment. And also, some people would have prolonged storage a bottle of expensive champagne, right? A lot of people are doing this. You probably have a sense of why they're doing this. Well, it's because this anticipation of consumption would bring this immediate pleasure and satisfaction to you, right? So thinking about a future vacation would make you happy, give you something to look forward to, give you some hope. And also, always think about some future pains would make your present miserable, right? So that's how anticipation would influence immediate well-being. So it has been demonstrated that anticipation of electric shock increases neural activity in the posterior elements of cortisol pain matrix, right? So only the anticipation of the pain could cause you painful. A neural activity in response to anticipated pain predicts tendency to expedite shocks. So here is an illustration. First, let's look at the consumption of monetary award, right? So we have different outcomes, obtaining $4, avoiding losing $4, and avoid losing $1,000. So here we see this corresponding discounting across time. So we do observe this decreased value of the corresponding $4 as we increase this time spent. And here is interesting to see that the corresponding discounting is lower when you look at the loss domain. And also, when you have a bigger amount of monetary payment, here is monetary loss, the corresponding discounting is also lower. So this is consistent with what we talked about before, the sign effect and the magnitude effect. What is interesting in this study is these two other possible consumptions, which is the kiss from your favorite movie star and an electric shock. And we see here this proportion of current value does not follow the corresponding discounting. So here you see kiss would bring you a higher pleasure if it's delayed a bit, right? You don't want to delay for 10 years, but it's better for you to delay it for 3 days, for 24 hours compared to immediately getting the kiss. Well, electric shock, you would rather to experience it sooner rather than 10 years later, because this 10 years of thinking about the corresponding electric shock make you miserable now, almost every moment, right? So that is a great example of how anticipation would influence the pleasure and the corresponding well-beings at the present. So that is discounting. And the last topic I want to discuss is self-control. So self-control, of course, is related to intertemporal decision-making because it's a great example of time inconsistency. But And time control is also quite important, right? So here it shows the impact of self-control. So we see here self-control. So here we see that self-control, a lack of self-control is correlated with crime and single parenting, right? So it have a great influence on your life outcomes. Talking about self-control, then we have to discuss one famous experiment demonstrating how self-control would influence people's children's future performance in the job market decades later. So in this experiment, the so-called marshmallow test, the little children, usually just 4 or 5 years old, they are asked to wait in the room. They are given a marshmallow, and they were told that they could just consume this marshmallow immediately, or they can wait for 2 minutes in order to get another marshmallow. So that's again an intertemporal decision making, right? And in this task, the average waiting time barely over a minute, right, for those 4 or 5 years old children. And this delayed gratification in this experiment would correlate with their later SAT scores, educational attainment, body mass index. So after 10 years. And so this demonstrated self-control would have a great influence on your future performance. Right? So here I want to provide a caveat about how to interpret the result. Right? So this again is correlation. Your delayed gratification is correlated with future SAT score. But this original experiment did not account for, while explaining the result, about the socioeconomic status of the family. Right? It's usually when you are from a high socioeconomic status family, a rich family, then your parents are more likely to keep promises, and there are not a lot of uncertainty, not a lot of ambiguity and risk you experience, and you will develop more trust towards other people. So it is mainly this socio-economic status of the family that are correlated with the corresponding performance, right? But it's not necessarily the delayed gratification, because it's in rich family, you are more likely to trust the experimenter to give you the one additional marshmallow if you wait. If you live in an impoverished family, your parents never keep their promises, so that means you do not trust other people. Right? So suppose you believe your parents that you study hard and they promise you toy, and they fail to provide that to you. That would have a really bad consequence on your feeling of trust towards other people. And that is reflected as not being able to delay gratification. Okay? So again, that's just the caveat of interpreting this result. But in order to understand this self-control problem, we could introduce this planner-doer model, right? So this is just a model for us to understand what is likely to going on in our brain when we experience the self-control problem. Why do we have present bias and self-control problem? Intrapersonal conflict can observe between the planner, which is mainly the prefrontal cortex, and a series of short-lived doers, which are driven by our limbic system. A doer is selfish and does not care about future doers, and the planner, in contrast, care about the utility of the series of doers. And the planner, however, has limited control over the doers, especially when the doer is aroused by alcohol, etc., etc. And that means this visceral influence and the emotional influence is strong. The planner would have limited or even less control. Resisting temptation incurs immediate and salient costs for the doer. And on the other hand, the long-term benefits, even though they may be rewarding to wait, but the long-term benefits seem distant and intangible. It would take time to be visible. So this planner-doer model can also be understood from these two systems of thinking. Right? To system one, what you are thinking is the most important thing. Right? So this also implies something that can help with our self-control problem. Usually something out of sight would mean that it's also out of mind. So if the rewards of the marshmallow is out of sight, then most of the kids were able to wait a much longer time. Right? So the average waiting time would be 11 minutes compared to 1 minute if they are not able to see the marshmallow, because that means you would get rid of the temptation. So you will not be able to see it. It will not always be on your mind tempting you. And also we observe that some kids employ some tactics to distract themselves. And then this distraction actually help them to wait for a longer period of time. Right? So those distracting themselves or being told to think about something fun waited longer. Right? So this would have great implications, right? So if you want to control your diet, the best thing is probably to get away all the snacks out of your sight. So when you watch a movie, for example, if there are snacks around you, you would just unconsciously pick them up and causing you the problem of overeat, right? But if you always storage your fridge with healthy food like carrots, vegetables, then you are more likely to eat healthy, right? So out of sight, out of mind. It also important to keep in mind that if your system 2 is tired, it also reduces self-control. Right? So when there are some cognitive loads, it would increase the choice between fruit salad and the sweet or the cake. Right? Because when you have higher cognitive control, your system 2 would have a difficult time to impose self-control. So for you to choose a choice that is good for you. Now talking about how to solve the self-control problem, because we probably all want to make good decisions to control our temptation, right? To make decisions that good for us for the long run. We could have this pre-commitment strategy. In order to employ the pre-commitment strategy, it is important to realize that awareness or self-awareness is the first step in solving the self-control problem, right? It is also the first step of solving any decision biases. As we mentioned that the mother of all biases is probably overconfident. Well, it's because the overconfidence will make us not being able to be aware of all the other confidence we have. We always think that we can make reasonable decisions absent of all kinds of biases, right? So that's why the awareness of those biases is the first step of correcting those biases. Similarly, the awareness of the existence of self-control problem is the first step of solving this problem. You should be aware that as human beings, we all experience this problem. Don't be overconfident in overestimating your ability to resist temptations. And being aware of the problem, then pre-commitment strategy can be used. Right? The following story from the Greek mythology might help us understand the corresponding strategies to have this pre-commitment. So this story is about Odysseus, who won the war and get back home by ship. And along the way, they know that they will encounter the territory of a siren. So the siren can sing beautiful songs, and it's very beautiful. Everyone would enjoy it a lot. But if you hear the song, you will be tempted and actually drive to the rocks and wreck the ship. You will die. So now the Odysseus really want to hear the song. So he wants to know how beautiful it is, but he does not want himself to wreck the ship and die, right? So what he does is to order all the crew to block ears with beeswax. So that means they are not able to hear the songs from the siren. So there's no temptation for them to wreck the ship. On the other hand, Odysseus also ordered the crew to tie himself to the mast. All right. So that means he will be able to hear the songs from the siren, but he cannot act on the temptation. Right. So these two ways actually illustrate this story actually illustrate the two ways in solving the self-control problem, the pre-commitment strategy. One, you just get rid of the temptation, and the other is that get rid of the possibility of taking action on the temptation. Right? Here is one example from Victor Hugo. Famous authors also experience self-control problem. Well, Hugo is not an exception. In order to meet the deadline of finishing the novel, he locks all his formal clothes away except a shawl to cover himself. That means he can do nothing else but to write and finish the writing. Here is another example. If you go to the suburb of many developing countries, you will see many unfinished houses. Sometimes you see full walls with no roof, sometimes with a roof but no windows. Sometimes you see beams sticking out of the roof, etc. Most of these houses have not been worked on for months. So you might be thinking that these residents there have really poor planning. So they do not have enough money, but they decide to build a house. So in the end, they have unfinished house. But if you truly ask and talk to the residents there, it's actually their pre-commitment strategy of saving. So once you have some extra money, what do you do with those money? So in the poor families, right? So there are a lot of temptations. You can use this for multiple ways. If you do not plan well, you might just buy some food and enjoy yourself, and you will not be able to renovate your house or to have a new house. But if you spend the money to purchase some bricks and build a house, right? So there's no way you can use the money. In that sense, you are able to save the money to the bricks, right? So that actually forces you to save. Even though it's a slow process, but after 1 year or two, you'll be able to get a new house. So that's actually a smart pre-commitment strategy. Talking about pre-commitment, I want to introduce one study that illustrate how pre-commitment can help with procrastination problem. Okay. So in this study, the students in the course, they have 3 proofread tasks to be finished within 3 weeks. And they are paid by how many errors are caught, and they will receive some penalty if they miss the deadline. Okay. So the participants are divided into 3 conditions. The first condition, they have evenly spaced deadline. The second one, they have self-imposed deadline. And the third one is there is only one deadline towards the end of the 3 weeks. If you assume people are rational, you probably would imagine that there's only one final deadline would give you the most flexibility. You can decide how many to finish and how to progress, and you can have better time management so that these tasks would not seriously interfering with your other tasks or with your life. Right. Now let's look at the result. The performance of this participant are measured in 3 different outcomes: error detected, delays in submission, and earnings. And the evenly spaced deadline is represented as the dark bar. The self-imposed deadline are represented as the white bar, and the groups with only the deadline towards the end would have this bar with shadow. If we look at these 3 conditions, we see very obvious ordering. So universally, we have the best performance for this evenly spaced deadline, the most rigid condition. And then self-imposed deadline, even though not as good as this externally imposed deadline, is still significantly outperforms the deadline towards the end. So what is this telling us? We observe that people are aware of self-control problem, and we observe self-imposing deadlines could help with this procrastination, although it is not as effective as externally imposed deadline, right? So why do we claim that people are aware of the self-control problem? Well, because the self-imposed deadline, you can decide whether to postpone the deadline towards the very end of the semester of this 3 weeks time, right? So that again gives you the most flexibility. But people decide to give up some of the flexibility in order to solve their procrastination and self-control problem, right? So this is telling us that it's actually important to have a certain plan, to have certain deadline, that even if it's self-imposed. Now talking about self-control problem and pre-commitment strategies, there are actually quite a few different products that are commercialized based on this idea. So you can check the corresponding commercialized products. And here is a code I put there demonstrating how people are aware of the self-control problem. This is a code actually from a professor when he was doing her PhD thesis. PhD thesis takes a long time to finish, and you have all kinds of reasons to procrastinate. And this professor, when he was a student, asked one of his fellow students, say that, I promise to send you the paper on the 1st of next month, right? And now I'm writing you the check of 2,000 Danish kroners. So you keep this check If I'm not sending you the paper by the first of next month, you just cash this check, right? So this is a commitment strategy, right? Commitment device, because you certainly do not want to lose this 2,000 Danish kroner, right? Of course, losing that Danish kroner to losing that amount of money to your friends is not as bad, but it's probably that would motivate you a lot to finish this paper on time. So that is our discussion for today about intertemporal decision making. To summarize, we have learned that people exhibit time inconsistency. They overweight in immediate payoff. That means they exhibit present bias, and they experience self-control problem. Tempo discounting is related to how close the future self feels towards the present self. And we also learned that anticipation of dread or savoring influences immediate well-being and intertemporal decision-making. Pre-commitment can help cope with self-control problem. There are two ways to employ this pre-commitment strategy. One is to remove the temptation. The other is to add frictions so that it's not easy for you to act on the temptation.